Night of Camp David, Chapter 9. Secret Service. Chief Arnold Brothers slumped into a chair in his office in the old Treasury building. Didn't like the taste and smell of the whole business. It was one thing to track down the nuts who wrote anonymous letters, jumbled and obscene for the most part, which threatened the President of the United States. They were harmless usually, and it was no great problem for the U.S. Secret Service to persuade local mental health officers to take over the surveillance or to aid in quiet commitments to mental institutions. But something else again were these not infrequent incidents involving apparently normal, even influential persons. People grew emotional about politics and the issues, particularly in a campaign year, and they made alarming remarks about the president that they didn't really mean. Still, the Secret Service had to investigate. It couldn't afford to take a chance on anyone. Chief Brothers was a chunky, methodical man with curly brown hair and a bland face which masked his own nest of anxieties. Foremost among them was retirement. He couldn't quit the service on full pension. He could quit the service on full pension next year, and that he intended to do. The life of an agent was all right, despite the irregular hours and endless, tense waiting for the unexpected when one was a member of the White House detail. But this administrative job, crammed with budget disputes and laced by the intricate cross-webbing of politics, was for the birds in Brothers' opinion. The required obeisance to minor politicians grated on his pride. The errand boy role in which the White House frequently cast his men was galling. Despite the public glamour attached to his job, the inner world of Washington, everyone knew the Secret Service chief just didn't have the stature, the prestige, or the funds of the FBI director. And yet, if anything went wrong, it was his neck nevertheless. And now had arisen this curious, prickly situation involving the junior senator from Iowa, just when the chief's head felt like a stuffed cabbage from a bad spring cold. Brothers sneezed, yanked at his pocket handkerchief, and dabbed mournfully at his red-rimmed nostrils. He frowned as he thought of how the McVeigh business had started. An auto repairman in the little town of LaBelle, Florida, a man named Amos Palmer, had called Washington headquarters to report that a suspicious young man was nosing around town asking personal questions about President Hollenbach. Palmer said he hadn't liked the fellow's attitude. The agent on duty gave the matter a little thought, assuming the questioner was merely a newspaperman or a magazine writer, but he dispatched a teletype to the Miami office requesting a routine check. Miami ran the check, tracing a rental car through a license plate number which appeared on the motel registration card in LaBelle. The Miami office found that car had been rented in Tampa to Roger Carlson of Washington, D.C., although that was not the name which appeared at the LaBelle Motel's registration file. Carlson had a rental car credit card, and another routine check with the national office of the company revealed the card had been issued to a Roger Carlson, administrative assistant to Senator James F. McVeigh of Iowa. That's when Chief Brothers decided to send Luther Smith down to LaBelle to case the situation. Not that Brothers thought there was anything suspicious. He'd assumed that Carlson was simply on some private political mission, one of these wheels-within-wheels affairs he encountered all the time in Washington. Still, he'd taken the precaution of sending Smith into the field because President Hollenbach was not the sort who'd appreciate someone padding out, making secret inquiries into his private life. Brothers knew intuitively that if Hollenbach ever learned of the LaBelle case, he'd demand an immediate report, so Brothers wanted to be in the clear, ready with the full and undiluted word. This presidential flunky aspect of his job especially annoyed Chief Brothers. He and his agents were supposed to safeguard and protect the person of the president, and ever since the assassination of President Kennedy, Brothers had been an agent in Dallas that day. The task weighed on them all like a shroud. But the SS men were distracted from their job by these auxiliary chores every president thrust upon them. They were required to run errands, carry speeches, function as valet at times, act as a president's private detective, and sometimes even as babysitter or wife comforter. Brothers sighed wearily and patted his oozing nose with his handkerchief. He resented Smith's detailed report on his trip to LaBelle and his interview with Senator McVeigh because it spelled unneeded grief. Suddenly, the chief found himself pitched into one of those swampy messes from which he instinctively recoiled. McVeigh apparently had lied to Smith. His explanation of Carlson's poking around LaBelle, asking strange questions about the president, had been a limp one. It was one of those flimsy cover stories that any agent would suspect, so Brothers felt compelled to order an investigation of McVeigh, and he didn't like it one bit. A senator, if harassed or offended, could make life miserable for the bureau chief, and that, Brothers well knew, was all he was. The public might invest his job with mystery and thrills, but Brothers knew he was just another government employee with his neck out for anybody to take a swipe at. He only hoped that Smith had proceeded with discretion so that Senator McVeigh wouldn't get word of the checkout. Brothers looked at his wristwatch and flipped a switch on the squawk box. "Is Smith there yet?" "He's just coming in now, Chief," was the metallic response. "I'll send him right in." Agent Luther Smith swarmed into the small room alive with energy, flashing his pearly smile. Brothers eyed him apprehensively and then sneezed, a small explosion that rocked his padded frame. Smith took an armchair near Brothers' desk and opened a loose-leaf notebook. "This thing is getting gusty, Chief," he said. His voice had the buoyancy of an investigator who had just discovered a corpse on the patio. "What have you got?" Brothers asked, like an old man who'd rather not hear. "I've questioned 6 pretty good friends of McVeigh, all on a security basis." "You sure they won't talk?" Brothers asked moodily. "I don't trust anyone in this town." "Positive," said Smith cheerfully. "I told them this was a routine check and we didn't want to embarrass anybody. They all promised to keep mum. Anyway, I'll make out a full report for you, but there isn't a great deal in it to expect for Paul Grissom, the lawyer." Just one sec. "What did he have to say?" "Plenty. But he didn't want to at first. He said because of his special relationship to the president and McVeigh, he'd rather not mention any discussions with the senator. But I kept pressing, and he finally agreed to talk. He says McVeigh came to see him last week with an odd story about a man in high government who, McVeigh claimed, was having some kind of severe mental trouble. McVeigh described the symptoms which Grissom says added up to paranoia, a persecution complex, all sorts of people out to get him, coupled with some screwy scheme to save the world, a delusion of grandeur. McVeigh says Grissom was highly agitated and refused to name the person, said he wanted advice from Grissom on what to do. Grissom says it was so obvious what should be done, either get Hollenbach to give the guy the bounce or take the fellow to a psychiatrist. Then he began to wonder about whether it was McVeigh. The more the senator talked, says Grissom, the more he became convinced that McVeigh was describing his own condition. In a word, that McVeigh was the guy who was off his rocker. "Oh no," Brothers groaned. "We need that like a hole in the head. Did Grissom give you any idea what he thought McVeigh's trouble was?" "Yeah," said Smith, with more relish than Brothers thought seemly at the moment. "Grissom lives on O Street, and he says he has seen a guy who he swears is McVeigh coming out of an apartment that belongs to a real sex cart. Her name is Rita Kirsicki, and she works for Joe Donovan at the Democratic headquarters." "You know her?" "Yes. I've talked to her some. She's an eyeful, Chief." Smith's face darkened slightly. "In fact, well, I don't blame McVeigh." "But what's the girl got to do with the price of oats?" asked Brothers. "I couldn't keep count of all the wheels in the city who have a little piece tucked away somewhere." "I know, but Grissom thinks it may be different in McVeigh's case. McVeigh has a swell wife and daughter, and Grissom thinks he's the kind of man who can't two-time his wife without brooding about it and rebucking himself, and getting all messed up generally." "You buy that?" Brothers' blue eyes questioned sharply from his smooth, bland face. No, I don't, Chief. I think McVeigh is pretty uncomplicated, someone who wouldn't think much about it. He's not one of those worried introverts, at least that's my hunch, and I've talked to him quite a bit. But he lied to you about this LaBelle business. Yeah, I can't understand that. He says he's writing a biography on Hollenbach and that he needs this early background stuff, but it seems funny that he'd be writing the book with everything else he has to do. Especially when he's obviously running for vice president, said Brothers. And what's more, I get the impression that he's running with the president's encouragement. Of course, maybe he is writing a book, but then why lie? And why did he lie about that report from Carlson? He told me he had no written report from Carlson, but I'm sure I saw it on the desk yesterday afternoon. And then last night Carlson admitted to me that he'd made a written report. And why should this Roger Carlson go around the country under an assumed name? Brothers spoke as though questioning himself. Not only did he use an assumed name, said Smith, but he told people he was from Omaha. Of course, McVeigh explained that readily enough. He said if Carlson went under his real identity, people would clam up and refuse to talk to him. Did that make sense to you? Not exactly. Who'd know Roger Carlson? And of course, when I asked McVeigh if it wasn't unusual for a fellow to write a book about a man who's his running mate might be, he just laughed and said it was pretty unlikely the lightning would ever strike him. But if it did, he said, such a book would be unique. I agreed there, but then asked him the name of his publisher. He looked startled and said he didn't have one yet, that he was just really getting started. Has McVeigh ever written a book? Asked Brothers. No, we checked that out. Not even a magazine piece. Brothers had the appearance of a man being pestered by sandflies, his face bunched in irritation. There had to be an easy answer, but it eluded him. Maybe he's doing a book and maybe he's not, he said, but I wonder if there isn't some political angle. It's a cinch he's investigating the president's early life, but why? Well, suppose he's afraid Hollenbach may not take him for vice president. And suppose he manages to come up with some unsavory odds and ends about the president that Hollenbach would rather not have revealed. All right, then McVeigh's in a position to put the squeeze on Hollenbach. Smith shook his head, pursing his lips in dissent. Oh, McVeigh's not that kind of guy. I can't see him mucking around like that. You're talking blackmail. This guy's pretty a straight shooter. Still, Brothers said, Hollenbach is a very proud man who'd hate to see his image tarnished, even by some old incident, and McVeigh probably understands that about the president as well as we do. Forget it, Chief, said Smith emphatically. Jim McVeigh's not the type. There's no malice in the guy, and he's no conniver. And what's more, I don't buy that explanation of Grissom's either. McVeigh's too stable a man to get upset and go into an emotional funk just because he happens to sleep now and then with some dame he isn't married to. Well then, what's the answer? Brothers eyed Smith accusingly as though he'd let the service down by becoming the courier of bad news. I don't know yet, but I'm as sure as I'm sitting here that we've nothing to worry about. Whatever McVeigh's reason, he's no oddball. He's not about to harm the president, and after all, Chief, that's our only concern, isn't it? Not quite. I've got to be ready in case Hollenbach finds out about this. Somebody could always call him from LaBelle. Brothers sniffed, his eyes watering. I kept coming back to one thing. It keeps bugging me. What's that, Chief? Those knives you saw in McVeigh's den. You mean that old surgical collection? Yes. Now that's a mighty weird hobby, Luther, for a U.S. senator. Oh, it isn't a hobby of McVeigh's. He says his father collected surgical instruments, and the senator just keeps them around as a souvenir of the old man's. I don't like it, Brothers said. I don't know what this is all about, but I don't like the smell of it. It is strange, Smith admitted. We've only got one obligation in this mess, said Brothers, and that's to protect the president. I don't know what's going on yet, but when a fellow who keeps his little knives around the house begins asking suspicious questions about the president, I do want to know why. Brothers stood up and shook his head. A man only a year away from full pension had enough troubles with this sour brew being thrown in his face. Luther, he said, I don't like to do it, but I want Senator McVeigh kept under constant surveillance, and I want the interviewing continued, but be careful for God's sake. Maybe there isn't anything wrong with McVeigh, but if there is, you know something. What? He wouldn't be the first crazy congressman in this cruddy town. Chief Arnold Brothers shrugged sadly. Then his nose began to itch, and he wiped his sodden handkerchief aloft just in time to meet another violent sneeze.